Now we begin the study of chapter 8. The theme of chapter 8 revolves around the believer's obligation of reciting the verses of the Bayán until the advent of him whom God shall make manifest. The entire chapter consists of about 30 handwritten lines in the original language. A little over a quarter of this chapter has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, and the translated excerpts are as follows. The Bab writes, I swear by the most holy essence of God, exalted and glorified be He, that in the day of the appearance of him whom God shall make manifest, 1,000 perusals of the Bayán cannot equal the perusal of a single verse to be revealed by him whom God shall make manifest. He then goes on to say, ponder a while and observe that everything in Islam hath its ultimate and eventual beginning in the book of God. Consider likewise the day of the revelation of him whom God shall make manifest, he in whose grasp lieth the source of proofs and the source of proofs, and let not erroneous considerations shut thee out from him, for he is immeasurably exalted above them, inasmuch as every proof proceedeth from the book of God, which is itself the supreme testimony, as all men are powerless to produce its like. Should myriads of men of learning, versed in logic, in the science of grammar, in law, in jurisprudence, and the like, these are the sciences, by the way, that he says you should not partake in to the believers. It's the injunction, but he says should myriads of men of learning, versed in logic, in the science of grammar, in law, in jurisprudence, and the like, turn away from the book of God, they would still be pronounced unbelievers. Thus, the fruit is within the supreme testimony itself, not in the things derived therefrom. And know thou of a certainty that every letter revealed in the Bayán is solely intended to evoke submission unto him whom God shall make manifest. For it is he who hath revealed the Bayán prior to his own manifestation. This was referred to previously in other chapters of Book 4, if you recall, where the Bab states that the author of the Bayán is him whom God shall make manifest. And this is obviously is in consonance and in congruence with what the Guardian has pointed out and highlighted in his dispensation of Bahá'u'lláh, quoting Bahá'u'lláh from Surat al-Haykal, where he states that the reality of Bahá'u'lláh and the Bab are one and the same. In his book on the writings of the Bab, Dr. Nader Saidi analyzes the theme of Book 5, Chapter 9, and provides English translation of several excerpts from this fascinating chapter of the Bayán of Farsi. If you want to see Dr. Saidi's explanation, you should refer to the pages of 335 to 336 of his book. Saidi writes, in Gate 9 of the fifth unity, the Bab declares that any name of anything must be seen as the embodiment of various names of God. In other words, each letter of a name should be seen as the abbreviation of one of the names of God. He then goes on to quote these excerpts. The substance of this gate, the Bab writes, is that inasmuch as nothing possesses reality except through the grace of God, glorified and exalted be He, and that a day is destined for each thing to attain unto its utmost perfection, when all its potentialities shall be manifestly realized, and it is only then that it is worthy to be called by a name of God within its own limit, and not the limit of that which is above it. And inasmuch as God hath commanded the people of the Bayán to elevate all things to their uttermost limit of perfection, he hath granted them permission to call everything through the letters of their names by the names of God. Lauded and magnified is he, that none may see in anything aught save the countenance of the revelation of the will, in whom naught is seen but God. So this was the excerpts from chapter 9. Now moving on to chapter 10. In chapter 10, with 39 handwritten lines in the original language, the Bab begins with these words: Verily God hath designated the shape of Haykal, this five-sided star, if you will, for men, and the shape of circle, daire, as he refers to it, for women, that they may write therein that which they may desire from the Bayán. In this chapter, the Bab gets into a very fascinating yet abstruse and symbolic exposition about alphabetical letters and words and their spiritual significance. It is beyond the scope of our discussion to examine in detail the Bab's commentary on this topic, but it's very fascinating. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated by either the Baha'i World Center nor Dr. Saidi in his book have covered it. I'm actually surprised that Nader has not gone into this, but he may have in other ways covered this in other chapters, but not specifically on the Bayán. I did not see that, but again, I'm sure there's good reasons for that. In the 11th chapter of Book 5, the Bab reveals two obligatory prayers, one for the newborn and the other for the dead. The prayer for the dead, revealed here by the Bab, excuse me, consists of essentially the same verses as the Baha'i prayer for the dead, minus the opening supplication. And this is what I mean. So if you look in your Baha'i prayer book and you take a look at the congregational prayer for the dead that is read at the funeral, by the gravesite, as you're about to inter the remains of the deceased, it begins with a small prayer. Oh my God, this is thy servant and the son of thy servant who hath believed in thee and in thy signs. And it goes on to basically, there's no God but thee, the ever forgiving, the most generous. This was revealed by Bahá'u'lláh, added to the invocations that the Bab had already stipulated here in the Bayán. So the rest of it, the repetition of Allahu Akbar, the Bab says takbir, which in Islamic terms is Allahu Akbar. So Baha'u'lláh has changed Allahu Akbar to Allahu Akbar, but then the next 6 invocations that you say 19 times, they're all from the Persian Bayán. We all verily worship God. We all verily bow down before God. We all verily are devoted unto God. We all verily give praise unto God. We all verily yield thanks unto God. We all verily are patient in God. These are all exactly word for word from the Persian Bayán here. As far as the rest of the chapter, no parts of this chapter has been translated by either the Baha'i World Center or Dr. Saidi in his book. Chapter 11 consists of about 40 handwritten lines in the original language. Excuse me, I'm going to just take a moment to take a sip of water. Chapter 12 is entitled On the Burial of the Dead. So in chapter 11, the Bab talks about the prayer of the newborn and the prayer of the dead. And it's very interesting. The prayer of the newborn has invocations in a similar way as the prayer for the dead. But I believe that prayer has not been reinstated by Bahá'u'lláh. You don't have to observe that. It is a wonderful prayer. If people want to say it for the newborn, they can say it. I don't believe it's harmful at all, because it's the word of God. But it's no longer an obligation to say a prayer for the newborn. We're only obligated to say the prayer for the dead. Now, in chapter 12 is entitled "On the Burial of the Dead in Coffins Made from Marble Stones and Placement of a Ring with a cornelian stone on the deceased hand." In the Baha'i faith, if you look at the Kitab Aqdas, it's essentially the same, but Baha'u'lláh has then added some stuff to this. So the foundational part of this law, that you bury your dead in coffins made from stones. Now, again, you can still do that, but Baha'u'lláh said it can be wood. Here, the Bab says it has to be stone. And then placing the ring, it's the same in the Baha'i faith. However, on the ring, now there's a verse that needs to be inscribed on the ring. Okay, so in this chapter, the Bab discusses the rites of burial for the dead, as well as the spiritual significance and the interconnectivity of each individual's body and their spirit. Very fascinating, very deep. Again, we don't have time to go into it, but extremely fascinating. The entire chapter consists of only 19 handwritten lines in the original language. I would say about 1/3 of this chapter has actually been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center, and here are those translated excerpts. The Bab writes, "The substance of this gate or chapter is that as this physical frame is the throne of the inner temple, whatever occurs to the former is felt by the latter. In reality, that which takes delight in joy or is saddened by pain is the inner temple of the body, not the body itself." Very fascinating. Since this physical body is the throne whereon the inner temple is established, God hath ordained that the body be preserved to the extent possible, so that nothing that causes repugnance may be experienced. He then goes on to say, "The inner temple beholdeth its physical frame, which is its throne. Thus, if the latter is accorded respect, it is as if the former is the recipient. The converse is likewise true. Therefore, it hath been ordained that the dead body should be treated with the utmost honor and respect." So this is all that has been translated by the Baha'i World Center, which conveys the essence of what this chapter is. But the Bab goes further into various layers and nuances of this interconnectivity. But this is the foundational theme, and what has been chosen here by the House is very appropriate to really convey the underlying thought of what the Bab is sharing here. Moving on to chapter 13, it is entitled "On the Exposition of the Book of the Will for the Dead, according to what hath been ordained in the Bayán." So we've talked about the prayer for the dead, how to bury the dead, and now the will and testament. As the title indicates, in this average length chapter, which is about 33 lines, the Bab sets out the provisions of a believer's final will and testament. Unfortunately, no parts of this chapter has been translated by either the Baha'i World Center or Dr. Saidi in his book, but I have few things to share with you as far as translation here. In the opening lines of this chapter, the Bab writes, "The substance of this gate is that there is no greater bounty conferred by God upon his servants than the fact that he hath granted permission to them to worship him. Read that again. It's a bounty for us to worship him. That's what the Bab says. There is no greater bounty conferred by God upon his servants, upon his creatures, than the fact that he hath granted permission to them, actually permitted them to worship him. Because even worshiping him is up to him, whether he wants us to worship him or not. And hath given them the privilege that at the hour of their death, there would be a written will which would testify to his unity and justice, and that this cause and this creation is for him. The central theme of the next chapter, chapter 14, is purity and cleanliness. And this is a very fascinating, and the Bab spends quite a bit on this, and some of the areas that he covers is very much parallel in what Baha'u'lláh talks about, some of the abrogation of the misconceptions and sort of misguided principles introduced in the previous faith, namely Shia Islam, are again outlined here. So this is actually happens to be the longest chapter of Book 5, but unfortunately only a few lines of it has been translated into English by the Baha'i World Center. As fascinating as the Bab's exposition on the subject is, it is beyond our summary overview to examine in detail the various layers and nuances which the Bab introduces in his commentary on this topic. It's very fascinating what he goes into it. It just gets really deep into why purity and cleanliness and all that is all tied together in just a marvelous way. Baha'u'lláh has also emphasized the virtue of purity and cleanliness in his most holy book. If you look at paragraph 74, 75, and 76 of the Kitab Aqdas, essentially encapsulates what the Bab talks about, but then in a new framework in which Baha'u'lláh is establishing in the Kitab Aqdas, but ultimately very, very similar. Now, the following here are the two short excerpts from this chapter, which have been translated by the Baha'i World Center. The first excerpt is, God loveth those who are pure, not in the Bayán and in the sight of God is more love than purity and immaculate cleanliness. God desireth not to see in the dispensation of the Bayán any soul deprived of joy and radiance. He indeed desires that under all conditions all may be adorned with such purity, both inwardly and outwardly, that no repugnance may be caused even to themselves, how much less unto others. Chapter 15 continues on the theme of purity from chapter 14. Now this gets very interesting. The chapter is entitled, On That the Water Ye Were All Created From, and this is a reference to semen, hath been made pure by God in his book. The Bab begins this chapter by stating that the male semen, which was considered in Shia Islam as impure or najis, is clean and pure. Baha'u'lláh has also reconfirmed this injunction in the Kitab Aqdas, paragraph 74, in the onset of talking about cleanliness. Baha'u'lláh writes, God hath decreed in token of his mercy unto his creatures that semen is not unclean. Yield thanks unto him with joy and radiance, and follow not such as are remote from the dawning place of his nearness. Now, to some, you may look at this and say, well, what's such a big deal about, the purity of semen? And this goes on and really has many layers. And if you ask this question from me at the end, I will, in fact, give you a story related to a friend, a colleague of mine who was a Shia Muslim many years ago. And there was a discussion about this, and it will shed light on how this principle introduced by the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh are liberating both outwardly as well as inwardly, because the creation, the embryo that, remember, he talked about, this is purity, that we are pure from the moment of conception, and that, you know, this is the vehicle, but, you know, the sperm and the egg coming together, creating the embryo. Again, all of this are a divine design, and that there is also some, you know, the way it was made, and people were made to feel that this uncleanliness really affected their the sexual relationship of couples, and that's something that you know, in a very fascinating way, I will answer based on some of the personal encounters I had with discussion with some of these Muslim believers who believed in this principle, you know, very wholeheartedly. In chapter 16 of book 5, the Bab issues a rather special injunction. This is the part. This injunction was the injunction that really really touched me personally. There's a somewhat of a similar injunction in later books. I wasn't really aware of this one. This one is actually, you know, you will see it's very special and really affects even this class and how we interact with one another. So in chapter 16 of book 5, the Bab issues a rather special injunction in reference to intellectual dialogue between the believers. He writes that the most important thing, a'zam chizi in Persian, or the most beloved thing in the sight of God, and what he wishes to see established among the people of Bayán, Ahl Bayán, is the love they would have for each other. And then he goes on and says, such love, the Bab further writes, that no matter how high or low each individual be in the areas of comprehension and learning, based on his or her capacity, they would not belittle or censure one another. For whoever enters the faith of Bayán, this is now exact word of the Bab, for whoever enters the faith of Bayán is a believer, he says. And he adds that at whatever level the believer is aware of the realities of the cause of God, that is good. So whether you have a much deeper understanding of the faith of God, or whether you have a little, as long as you're devoted, as long as you believe, that is good in the sight of God, according to the Bab. And I believe this is the same in the revelation of Baha'u'lláh. Now, this is not to say that we must be content with understanding little. You know, Baha'u'lláh has commanded us in the Aqdas that we must immerse ourselves in the ocean of his revelation. It's actually a duty. So we must not content. But again, depending on, I mean, if that's the ocean, if I can give an analogy of swimming, some people like to go snorkeling, some people like to go deep sea diving. You know, it's all good. It's all good. Obviously, the more, Abdul Baha says in one of the passages in his writings, the deeper we go, the greater the treasures we will unravel, and the more we will become spiritually edified. So there is an advantage there. But at the same time, for example, if the individual just does not have the capacity or the learning or the education or whatnot, that does not make them inferior and they should not be viewed. And this is where he goes on, that you cannot censure them, you cannot belittle them. And he uses that word, rad kardan, which is a very complex word. So I would translate that as censoring and as essentially belittling someone, which was very common in, and still is very common amongst the Muslims of every denomination. The imams or the learned are obviously, they sit at with arrogance, not all of them, but the great majority of them, and dictate, and basically they have to be listened to, and if no one has the right to challenge them. For example, the ayatollahs in Iran and whoever, that when they give sermons, you see these hundreds and hundreds of people just listening, like basically sheep listening to this guy just speaking nonsense, absolute nonsense. Continuing on this theme, the Bab states that if a believer in Bayán belittles or censures another believer, then he must pay 95 misqals of gold. Not 19, 95 misqals of gold, which later on you'll find out this is about $15,000 US by today's standards. That's a lot of money, okay? So there will be a lot of poor Baha'is or a lot of poor Bábís, again, if this law was in place today. Unfortunately, I don't mean this in a negative way. I'm meaning it in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek and a bit of a joke, that we inadvertently say things that may hurt others. So we have to be very watchful. And so this shows how incredibly sensitive the Bab and his revelation is towards hurting another individual. And you'll see that the love, it's all about love and fellowship and enjoying, each other's presence, whether through learning, through fellowship, through all sorts of arts or whatnot. So and again, he explains why this punitive measure, this punishment, is for a reason, to really discourage people from doing this. So he says 95 misqals of gold as reparation to him whom God shall make manifest. So you don't give it to the individual, okay? So let's say if you censured Jack or Joe or whoever, and so Shahrukh has committed this error, then I have to make reparation as a Bábí. If obviously that could make me bankrupt by those days standards, stole a lot of money. But I have to give this money to him whom God shall make manifest, at his time. And obviously, if him whom God shall make manifest is not there, the head of the faith, which would have been the Bab at the time, but the Bab says this will go to him whom God shall make manifest. However, he says, it would be up to that son of truth, Shams Harirat. It's up to him whom God shall make manifest, the Bab adds, to forgive this violation if he chooses to do so. And the Baha'u'lláh has done that. In fact, you'll see that when you hurt somebody's feelings, there is a punishment of about 19 misqals of gold if you hurt someone's feeling. But Baha'u'lláh has in the Kitab Aqdas reinstated the law itself that you should not hurt people's feelings. However, the reparation amount he has forgiven. And he says, you don't have to. And again, it's for another specific law. But this one is very, very interesting. I wasn't even aware of this one, but here we are. So 95 misqals of gold. Now, the Bab goes on to say that God's intention with this measure of punishment is that no one in the revelation of the Bayán be emboldened to censure or belittle another individual. Oh my goodness. Only if the Azalis, Mirza Yahya and his cronies, had listened to just this one law, because they not only censured, they even ordered the assassination, which goes beyond all of this, of some of the believers who basically looked at Azal and said, oh, he's claiming to be him whom God shall make manifest. I can be better than that. I mean, this is why, Abdul Baha in Traveler's Narrative says that while Baha'u'lláh was absent in Soleimaniye during those 2 years of retirement, a large number of individuals, from the Bábí community claimed to be him whom God shall make manifest, because they looked at Azal and they said, really? This guy? Okay, well, I think I'm a lot more knowledgeable than him, so I guess if he claims to be him whom God shall make manifest, I guess I'm him whom God shall make manifest. I mean, Nabil Zarandi, he was one of those. And eventually, when Baha'u'lláh came back, he was so ashamed of that, and he through his act of penance, he did something that actually that Baha'u'lláh said that believers should have prevented him from doing that, because it was unworthy of Nabil Zarandi's station. But anyways, because he wanted to show his humility towards Baha'u'lláh and beg forgiveness, and this is while Baha'u'lláh had still not declared himself. So you see, it's very fascinating. But people like Sayyid Asadullah Dayan, who was one of the mirrors, one of the learned, very learned, in the Bábí dispensation, while Baha'u'lláh was absent, he had gone to visit Azal and seen his writings, and he said, "Oh my God, this guy is an absolute imposter." So he made a claim to attract people towards him, and Baha'u'lláh really loved Dayan and speaks very highly of him in the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, but also says that the order of his assassination. So Azal ordered that Mirza Asadullah Dayan be assassinated, and they carried it out. His cronies carried it out. They killed him. And this is one of the 2 acts that Baha'u'lláh said that when we came back from our retirement brought, unsurpassed pain to our heart. That just was a cause of tremendous grief and embarrassment, that such an act would be committed. So here, the Bab has made these provisions that such things would not happen, and yet those who claim that they are the guardians of the Bayán today, the head of that group was the antithesis of this injunction. So again, very fascinating, very thought-provoking, certainly. So it is interesting, and I wanted to add this: the Bab, after he talks about this, he does not not recognize the fact that people have different ranks, and Baha'u'lláh has talked about that. Okay, in fact, he elevates the ranks of certain people that as being greater than other believers, in the stations of, for example, the hands of the cause of God, and so on and so forth. So it is interesting to note that in the next sentence after this, the Bab does not acknowledge that, or does acknowledge that since every individual has different capacities, they do occupy a different rank, which is outwardly manifest. There were many great learneds that, again, an example of it during the time of Baha'u'lláh, many of these individuals that Baha'u'lláh called them by, Ismullahul Mehdi, the name of God, Mehdi, was Sayyid Mehdi Dahaji. Sayyid Mehdi Dahaji, who we have a tablet that is in the tablets of Baha'u'lláh, the tablet to Sayyid Mehdi Dahaji, was one of the early companions of Baha'u'lláh, but he was very arrogant. And he was an itinerant teacher and all that, but he almost had an adjutant and people around him. He certainly wasn't a humble man. And after the passing of Baha'u'lláh, he broke the covenant and broke the covenant of Baha'u'lláh and joined the ranks of Abdul Baha's half-brother, Mirza Muhammad Ali, and was lost to oblivion. But he was a learned man, but again, a very arrogant man, and again, humility is the operative word in this revelation, it seems. That we all must be humble no matter what station is conferred upon us. You look at all the hands of the cause of God, they're embodiment of humility. I mean, they've been elevated such high rank, and yet they consider themselves as the lowliest of all servants. So I find that to be a great blueprint for all of us, certainly for me. So again, the Bab does acknowledge that since every individual has different capacities, they do occupy a different rank, which is outwardly manifest, but yet does not give them the right to censure others just because they may be more learned in some shape or form. So that is really the key thing, the humility that even if they are knowledgeable, they have to perform in the service of others, which is the ultimate adornment, of every learned, is to be able to serve, other friends. Unfortunately, no parts of chapter 16 has been translated into English by either the Baha'i World Center or Dr. Saidi in his book. With about 52 handwritten lines in the original language, chapter 16 is the second longest chapter of book 5. Moving on to chapter 17. In chapter 17, the Bab introduces the obligation of repeating a specified phrase 95 times once in 24 hours. Sound familiar? Yes. The Bab goes on to say the substance of this gate or chapter is that from sunrise to sunset, God hath ordained that each individual repeat 95 times, Allahu Abha, God is the most glorious, or Allahu A'zam, God is the most great, or Allahu Azhar, God is the most manifest, or Allahu Anvar, God is the most luminous, or Allahu Akbar, God is great, or such similar type of powerful and exalted words that he in the day of resurrection of him whom God shall make manifest, through the blessings which the recitation of these holy names may bring, be guided and would attain to the recognition of that ancient countenance and that supreme day star. This is my humble translation of that first passage from. So this repetition, it says throughout the month. He gives the option. He just does not say you must say Allah Hapa, and yet obviously you'll see that this injunction has been reinstated by Bahá'u'lláh. So in paragraph 18 of the Kitab Aqdas, God has reiterated this injunction with a slight modification. This is Baha'u'llah's words. It hath been ordained that every believer in God, the Lord of judgment, shall each day, having washed his hands and then his face, seat himself, and turning unto God, repeat Allahu Abha 95 times. Very fascinating discussion. Again, the Bab talks about symbolisms in the chapter about what these represent and so on. But again, as you can see, Allahu Abha is a reference to Baha, and I believe Nader in his book, I know at least in one of his talks, he talked about the significance of what this 95 times Allahu Abha really went back to, again, underscored in some kind of a subliminal way of the name of him whom God shall make manifest. Chapter 17 is comprised of about 21 handwritten lines in the original language. Moving on to chapter 18. Chapter 18, the Bab briefly speaks about transactions between individuals, whether it be business or casual. He writes that God has permitted his servants to buy and sell from each other as long as there is mutual consent on both sides. He adds that the transaction is valid as long as it is clear that both are satisfied with it, no matter how big or small the transaction may be. He also states that it is permissible for merchants to charge interest in their transactions as was customary during that period. You remember the Bab was from a family of merchants, so he was very familiar with that. And back then they charged interest. So interest in Islam is actually not permitted, charging interest. I don't know how the Arab world now works, but in its purest sense, you're not allowed to charge interest on loans or anything like that. However, in this revelation, it has been permitted, but I think that has to be tempered with equity as well, because some of the loans, particularly some credit cards and so on and so forth, the interest is so astronomically high in percentage that becomes iniquitous to many individuals who can't afford to or hold the balance or so on and so forth. So again, this is something that, again, as a foundational point of view, the Bab talks about in this chapter. There's no parts of it have been translated or discussed anywhere, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Just give you a kind of a highlight of what it's all about. With only 10 handwritten lines in the original language, it is the shortest, actually, chapter of Book 5. So it's a very brief commentary about, you can have transactions between individual, but these are the conditions, basically. The very last chapter of Book 5, it's very interesting. The Bab, very practical chapter. Bab essentially defines the unit of weight by which pure gold should be measured. And I have, for those of you who may be interested, I have done the research and given you, basically based on, because this is the foundational statement by the Bab, which we now, even in the Baha'i Revelation, exactly we use. So the Bab introduces it in chapter 19 of Book 5. And he first of all states that 1 misqal, again, leading to misqal of gold, so 1 misqal equals to 19 nukhuds. Now, nukhud is dried pea, okay? Dried pea. So the Bab says 1 misqal is equivalent to 19 nukhuds that people can actually, see, because it was a dried, food that they made dishes out of. Now, Shoghi Effendi, this is quoted by the House of Justice in the compilation on Bahá'u'lláh. For those of you who are interested, it's in a letter from the House of Justice to an individual believer in the 1970s, late 1970s. They're quoting Shoghi Effendi's secretary, who wrote on his behalf that the weight of 24 nukhuds equal 4 3/5 grams. This means that 1 nukhud, then, to just do the math here, you can see I come from a math background as an engineer, so I've done some of the mathematical calculations here for you. 1 nukhud equals 0.1916667 grams, which is about 1/5 of a gram, roughly 1/5 of a gram. So therefore, 1 misqal equals 3.6416667 grams. So 19 misqals would be 69.19, and so on. 95 misqals, 345.958334 grams. And then we convert that, because eventually this is going to lead to weighing of gold. So the punishments of 19 misqal or 95 misqal, or even giving in, dowries and inheritance, this is the unit of measurement, is misqal in this revelation that has been introduced by the Bab in the Persian Bayán and reconfirmed by Baha'u'lláh in the Kitab Aqdas. Exactly. There's no modifications. So 1 troy ounce, the house, and this is exactly what it is, 31.103486 grams. Then 19 misqal is essentially, and we need to know this one, because for paying Bahá'u'lláh is basically 2.224563 ounces. That's the equivalent. For the 95 misqal, which is like that punishment of censuring someone, that's 11.1 ounces. since the price of 1 ounce of gold this last Friday was $1,330.90 in US dollars, then 19 mescal of gold is $2,960.67 US dollars, and 95 mescals of gold is $14,803.36. So it's a lot of money so we must be very guarded in our speech, as Baha'u'lláh asked us to be, especially people like me. I have to be very guarded and watch it, because I don't want to pay $14,000 in reparation, as much as I would love to pay. But you'd be bankrupt pretty quickly if this continues. However, Baha'u'lláh has absolved the individual of the actual payment to that. So therefore, so chapter 19 of book 5 is comprised of about 45 handwritten lines in the original language. Only a very small section of this chapter has been translated. In fact, the translated excerpt constitutes the last paragraph of this last chapter of the 5th Váḥid of the Bayán Farsi. So it's very apt and that this has been translated. It essentially concludes the 5th Váḥid with this excerpt, and this is the excerpt that the House of Justice have translated. It's a beautiful passage. There is no paradise, the Bab writes, in the estimation of the believers in the divine unity, more exalted than to obey God's commandments. And there is no fire in the eyes of those who have known God and his signs, fiercer than to transgress his laws and to oppress another soul, even to the extent of a mustard seed. On the day of resurrection, God will in truth judge all men, and we all verily plead for his grace. This ends our study of Book 5 of the Bayán Farsi. Now, if there are any questions, I'll be available to answer as best as I can any questions that would risen from these two sections, Book 4 and Book 5.
We have quite a few questions, actually. Though I'm not sure I understand some of them, because some of them, the first question here dates from 4:08 p.m. In other words, way back when we're dealing with Book 4, and it says, "Are these souls four first letters the Bab said at chapter?" I don't know what that means. So I don't know what that one refers to. What about the house of Baha'u'lláh in Adrianople? I guess that's another holy place.
Yes, the house in Adrianople, it is a sacred place, but it's not a place of Hajj.
Right.
There are holy places around, but it's not a Hajj. Only the house in Baghdad and the house in Shiraz is Hajj.
Let's see.
So any of the questions that perhaps are not clear, the friends can then post them on the forum, and we'll try to answer them. There. So we just look at the question.
Unfortunately, now we can't tell what books they're referring to in many cases.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that Muhammad's wife Khadija was the first believer. Runa asks. That's an interesting question.
Yes, it is. And the Muslims generally believe that it's it's very similar that in the revelation of the Bab as well, his wife, who's also named was Khadija Begum, he recognized the Bab perhaps a few days before as and I think in her memoirs, which Hassan Balyuzi has beautifully translated, talks about having seen the Bab, in that special state. And so, yes, when Muhammad came from Mount Hira, he was absolutely beside himself. He was, shaking. He was distraught when he received the vision that Archangel Gabriel brought to him in Mount Hira, where Iqra, and he said, Ma'aqra'u, I can't, recite. And so, and it's where his wife gently, Khadija, put the cloak over him to comfort him. Well, the Bab says that it was Ali who was the first to believe in him. So again, nobody was there to know the circumstances. Yes, you think that one's wife, one's spouse would be the first, but maybe Khadija at that time felt just Muhammad was distressed, or again, I don't know. There is not any kind of testimony that we can substantiate, on a very exact way. So we have to take the words of the manifestation of God. So if the Bab says Ali was the first to believe, then he was the first to believe. I mean, I wasn't there, so I'm certainly not going to, second guess. So, but certainly Khadija was among the early believers, if not the first. But again, sure. I don't have the answer.
Stuart asks this very interesting question regarding the house. If Tehran is the place associated with the first appearance of the manifestation, will there be a place of circumambulation there in the future? And why was Baha'u'llah's house in Baghdad to be the point of Hajj along with the house of the Bab in Shiraz?
Well, first of all, the why is because they purposed it. Both Baha'u'llah has revealed 2 tablets called Surat al-Hajj. It's in beautiful Arabic, and that he explains the rite of Hajj. The only person that fulfilled the rite of Hajj on behalf of Baha'u'llah, was sanctioned by him to do that, was actually Nabil al-Zarandi, the chronicler. That had actually, you had to shave your head and wear a certain garb. And then, Baha'u'llah in the Kitab Aqdas says you don't have to shave your head, but you still have to commit the Hajj. It's in questions and answers. But as far as the why, I mean, the place, Baha'u'llah's house in Tehran, and anything associated with Baha'u'llah in Tehran is obviously going to be very sacred. I think in future, the House of Justice, in the same way that they decided when and how to implement the Baha'i calendar, they're going to implement that when the time comes. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, I wish it did, but it sounds like it may not happen. It looks like it may not happen. So Tehran definitely has a special place as being the birthplace of Baha'u'llah. But the 2 houses of the Bab in Shiraz and in Baghdad are considered the 2 places of Hajj, pilgrimage Hajj, not just the standard pilgrimage that we experience or we go to today.
Yeah, and since it's the place of the declaration of the manifestation in that case too, with the Rezvan Garden, presumably that's also the reason why Baghdad has been singled out over Tehran, because that's the official point of the beginning of his ministry.
But that's outside of Baghdad. Was somewhat.
It's across the river.
Across the river, but anyways, we don't know. It's just that we follow what they say.
Yeah. And then there's, of course, people saying, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I must say, I'm very impressed that we started out with 19. We got up to 20. We got up to 21. We got up to 22. And we still have 20 people 3 hours later. So I salute people for their fortitude. This is very difficult to listen to something like this and watch it on a computer without having the person in front of you. In an evening class, even then 3 hours is difficult. And so I'm impressed that people have managed to last this long. I don't see any other questions here. I had a couple of comments of my own, if I can remember what they were, regarding this whole thing about the impureness of semen. A man from Africa, I think he wrote this in his book about his life, said that when he grew up as a young Muslim boy in his rural village, they would go to the imam in the morning and say, "I can't fast today because I had a wet dream last night." So that made them impure, and they could get out of the fast. Even if it didn't really happen, they would just say it did. You see, so it shows you how the idea can be manipulated in various ways.
Yeah, and the story this reminds me, I was going to share with you, was that when I started after university about 30 years ago, when I started working at an engineering firm, my immediate supervisor, was a very devoted Shia Muslim. And I think through a conversation once, again, I don't know how we got to that, he mentioned about the impurity that whenever him and his wife would have sex
relations, yeah,
they would have to immediately, after the sex, they would have to immediately get out of bed, change their sheets, and go have showers, because of the fact that it was so impure. And and I thought to myself, wow, what a chore and what a difficulty that you put yourself, and take away that beautiful interaction, the joy of it, or anything. I mean, and just this kind of, and here Baha'u'lláh and the Bab have liberated, us both on the spiritual aspect dimension of it, but also on the physical and
right.
Dimensions of it. So I kind of found that was very telling, that there are people who probably turned their whole life upside down with that
time. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's probably worth mentioning that menstrual blood was also considered impure.
That's right.
That was probably an even bigger injunction in some ways. In some societies, women had to bathe themselves and they had to isolate themselves in many societies.
Wow.
Because of that belief, not just in Muslim societies, but others as well.
Sure.
And all of that, of course, has been relegated to the same status as the idea of cooties. Now purity or impurity is based on the germ theory, shall we say, instead of on various other pre-scientific notions of what constitutes clean and what constitutes pure. And we, in that sense, we have been greatly liberated in the faith. There's that statement by Baha'u'lláh somewhere, I guess it's in the Octus, we've made all things pure.
Yes.
And that really is a very important development in religion.
I want to say, in that chapter, I mean, I went through a little bit of it, but that chapter goes into extensively. I mean, there's one part of it that the Bab says that if you repeat the word Allahu Athar, God is the most pure, 66 times, any object will become pure. So it's very, very interesting. Again, I didn't share that just because, again, it's, I mean, there were other dimensions to it as well, but sure. I found that, 66 times, if you recite it, and speak to that, whether it's this book or whether it's that chair, then it apparently becomes pure, after 66 times. So very, very fascinating. It's just, but it's so many layers and so many nuances. Yeah.
Gwyn says about the Bab and scientific doors opening, we have a prime example in the Dawnbreakers where the Bab says that he had to content himself with the juice of a sweet lemon, and he prayed that the pilgrimage journey would become easier for the friends. Shortly after that, steam was used. Also, Adib Taherzadeh mentions about technology in Revelation of Baha'u'lláh, Volume 3, I think. When something is needed, it becomes manifest, like photocopying machines, desktop computers, internet, etc.
Yes, that is.
I've heard Christian missionaries say exactly the same thing. It's worth pointing out. you know, that God has brought all these things so that the world can be missionized for Christ. So it's worth noting that too.
Yes.
We don't have anything else here right now. The one thing you said which confused me, and unfortunately didn't write it down, so I'm not sure where it was, but you mentioned it was an injunction about taking possessions from non-believers. Now, I think by injunction you mean it's a command to take them away from the non-believer, because I always think of an injunction as something forbidding something, which is not the way the word is supposed to be used, I think. It's just a command.
Yeah, it's a command.
I got a little confused because if you think of this as an injunction, it's forbidding you to take things from non-believers. I think what you mean is that it's an injunction that they're supposed to take it from non-believers. I just got confused myself.
Yes, and restoring it. Yeah, I mean, you can use the word ordinance. You know, it's a statute. You know, that law. You know, it's a any of those. So again, where he says you expropriate the non-believers, the possession of non-believers, and then when they become believers, you restore it back to them. You know,
right.
If and when they do. Yeah, so it's very complex, but just I wanted to just share that, you know, as far as what he's talking about. But then I think it's more of a transitional, you know, law that it restates what has been, you know, recognized by Muslims, you know, for centuries, and then modifies it, and then eventually abrogates it, you know.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. A couple of more questions have popped in now. The Bob Stewart says the Bob, in saying that the most important thing was love among the people of the Bayán, Jesus said that the world would know his followers by their love for one another. So it's a very similar teaching than the New Testament. Heather asks, is it only the believers that should not belittle or censure each other, or does it apply to all people?
Well, in this case, I mean, the Bob has zeroed in on the believers special, because it's a law. I mean, yes, he should. The Bob and Bahá'u'lláh both have said anyone, but I think this particular injunction is to not censure, you know, or belittle believers. So the believers would be united. They would not be disunited through their criticisms of one another. You know, I mean, it's basically saying, you know, do not criticize them, do not put them down, do not, you know, if somebody comes up and, you know, says something and you know it's not correct, you can gently, Baha'u'lláh has further says, if you possess a certain knowledge, a jewel, share it with kindliness and, you know, with forbearance, and educate people rather than, you know, censure them. So it's just it's a matter of education. Yes. Yeah.
Right. Let's see. Nesreen says, what does the Bob say about taqiyya, dissimulation? That's what it is, right? Dissimulation.
Well, right now we haven't gone to about taqiyya. We haven't. I mean, we'll see at the end. So if by the end of the Persian Bayán there was no mention of taqiyya, you can ask me that question later. But I rather reserve that answer for later on, please. Yeah.
Nima Rafi'i says, regarding the station of Qudus as described by the Bab in the Persian Bayán as the one whom 8 Váḥids, or is it Váḥids, I don't know, of the Bayán. Váḥids. Does the designation of 8 Váḥids have anything to do with the revelation of the remaining Váḥids of the Bayán? Or could the person of Qudus somehow be seen as the fulfillment of these 8 Váḥids of the Bayán, specifically the Arabic Bayán? Just conjecture, especially knowing the Igan is seen as the completion of the Persian Bayán.
Well, I think Nadir Saidi talks about this in his book, and this reference by the Bab. So I would suggest reading that, and that may shed some light. There is some symbolism there. But as I said, what the Bab generally has stated, this elevation of the rank of Qudus, was because of his devotion, his detachment, and his obedience to the manifestation of God that made him be elevated and exalted by God. So I think I don't want to get into too much of its other hidden meanings, because there could be much more there. But at this stage, I think it's important for us to understand the primary purpose or the primary reason for him being singled out, which the Bab says it's not because he was special, it's because what he did. So this goes back to that the essence of one's faith is fewness of words and abundance of deeds. As Baha'u'lláh says, Ra'sul Iman huwa taqallal fil qawl wa takassur fil amal. So it's about what they did. These early believers, they had to break out of their comfort zone. They had to do things that was so unorthodox, but yet it won them the favor of their Lord and made them exalted, until the time of the end.
Right.
Yeah. So
I think that's pretty much it that we have in terms of questions.
Yeah, we've had quite a long time. I think let everybody go, and I need to go and have a break as well.
Exactly. You're the one who's been speaking. I'm amazed your voice has held up so well.
Yeah, I'm starting to lose it, but
during the fast, you'll manage.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Shahrukh. This has been a fascinating program.